All right, we finished off most of the HTML tags that we're going to need in order to build a website. We left off a few of the HTML5 form element tags. There's been quite a few new tags introduced for forms and some other tags that we just didn't look at in this introduction series, but we will cover when we start to build our website. The last major topic we need to understand for HTML in order to segue us into the CSS portion of this intro series is what's known as the box model. Now, the box model refers to a model which block tags in HTML behave and how they render. And so I'll quickly show you this slide to illustrate how the box renders out. Let's assume that the box that's going to be displayed in this slide is just a simple div tag for now. The box model first consists of a margin. Now, margin is an invisible space around the outside edges of the element. So it's kind of like a cushion on the outer edges. Inside of the margin is the border, and the border is visible or invisible. I can turn the border off or I can turn the border on and give it a width and a height. Border comes inside of the margin. Inside of the border is what we call padding, and padding is another invisible cushion. So that's the cushion between the border and the actual width or content of the div. So again, there's the margin, which is the outer cushion. Padding is the inner cushion. Border is between the two. And then the contents, or the white, is just the natural width and height of the element, depending if it's block or inline or how your page layout is rendering that element. Now, what's important to note is the way that the box model renders. And this is a little bit different between browsers, and this is actually one of the main points of, I guess we could call it confusion among the browsers in the early web design days, is Internet Explorer rendered the box model differently than Chrome and Safari and some of those Firefox and these other early browsers. And so there was quite a bit of difference on how your page would look between browser to browser because the box model was so differently rendered. So we'll look at what the CSS specification calls for and how the box model should be rendered. And in order to understand this, we have to divide up the sections. So down here, the black lines, this refers to the width of the margin. This is the width of the border. This is the width of the padding. And then in between here would be the width of the content. Now, these numbers that I'm going to throw up are not to scale. They're just for illustration purposes. But let's assume we have 40 pixels of margin assigned, and we have 15 pixels of border, and we have 20 pixels of padding. And let's assume that we assign 400 pixels of width. So the important thing to remember with the box model is if we assign all these values, not only are they on the left side, but come over here to the right, they're also assigned to the right. So we also have 40 here, and 15 here, and 20 here, and then 400 there. So make sure that you account for the left and right sides for the margin, border, and padding. Now, assuming we had these values, that would give us an overall width of 550 pixels. So outer margin to outer margin, which is really how much space this element would take up on screen, would be 550 pixels, even though we set width equal to 400. So it's a little bit confusing because we would go in our CSS and we would assign width equals 400, and you would think, well, this element's going to be 400 pixels wide, but it's not, because we have to add the padding, the border, and the margin on the left and the right side to actually get the overall width that this element will take up. This is the way that the box model works, and this was a little bit of the confusion between the browsers in the early days and how this was rendered. So just make sure you understand this simple model here, and you'll be able to build your websites. So let's switch back over to our web browser, and I'll show you a practical example of the box model in code, and you'll be able to see a little bit better how that works. So I'm going to jump back to my browser. Now I have a web page set up with some CSS already in place up here and a little bit of HTML down here. So you don't need to worry about the CSS for now. Let's just focus on the HTML, and I'm going to tag that down a little bit so we can just isolate this element essentially. So right here, I just have a single div on the page, and I've added some CSS to it so you can see this div. And if we switch over here to the web browser, this is what the box looks like. So I have a div, and it's got some content, and right now it has a border assigned to the div. And you can see that everything just kind of touches edge to edge to edge. So I'm going to slowly add in the portion here of the box model so you can see how it works. So I'll come to this div up in my CSS, and again, don't worry about this. We're getting into CSS in the next videos. So I'm going to come into this box, and I'm going to say padding. Actually, I'll start with margin. Margin, let's set to 20 pixels. So again, margin back from our PowerPoint is the outer area. So if we save that and go refresh our page, you can see now there's a 20 pixel cushion. Again, it's invisible, but it's pushing this element 20 pixels away from anything that would touch it otherwise. Now let's go back and add some padding. So we'll say padding, and let's say 10 pixels of padding. So again, back to our chart here, the padding is the inner cushion in between the margin and the content. So we'll come back to our web browser and refresh. And you can see that adds 10 pixels of cushion all the way around. It's a little bit easier if we highlight this text. You can see there's 10 pixels all the way around there. And that's what the padding is doing. And then the highlighted text just refers to the width of the element. So if I was to come into here and set a width on this element right now, I'll say width equals 300 pixels, and we'll save that and refresh. Now this element's 300 pixels wide. I'm way zoomed in, so that's obviously not to scale. But I have 20 plus, I don't know how much I set to the border. Let's look at that. The border, I believe, was 5 pixels. So I have 20 plus 5 plus 10. So there we're at 35 plus 300. So now we have 335 plus 10, 345 plus 5, 350 plus 20, 370. So really this box is taking up 370 pixels of screen space. And even though the width says 300. So just make sure you understand the box model and how that works, because the padding and margin and border values add to the width value that you explicitly declare. And then if I was to do another element directly after this, let's just go add another, I'll just add a span tag and say hello. The span tag does nothing by default. It's just a simple inline tag that's used for hooking with CSS. And I'll save that and refresh. And notice that it appears at the top like it's supposed to, but it's got that margin here, so it can't bump up against that because there's that 40 or 20 pixel margin here. So you can see kind of how the box, how that padding, margin, and border affected this div over here, but I don't have any of those properties assigned to this span, so it just appears right at the top where it normally would. And being in line, it appears on its own line. Had I done a div tag, let's add another div tag with the same ID just to illustrate this. So technically we can't have two IDs of the same name. We'll get to that when we get to CSS. You can see with the div tag, because they're block, it forces it down on its own line. And there's a 20 pixel margin on the bottom here, but there's also a 20 pixel margin on the top of this one. So there's actually 40 pixels between these two. And they're both covering the 360 or whatever it was we calculated earlier space horizontally. So that's how the box model works and how it's rendered. I would just kind of pause the video on this slide and kind of make sure you understand how those different attributes affect the overall width and height of the box.